Welcome to Novelist Spotlight. This is Mike Consol, your host. Two quick things before introducing you to my guest. First, I encourage you to subscribe to this podcast by clicking on the follow button and also clicking on the bell icon so you're alerted to each new edition of the program. Second, in addition to being the producer of this podcast and interviewing novelists, I am a novelist myself. I've written 4 books, 3 novels, and 1 short story collection. In the episode notes, you will find a short link to my Amazon page and all 4 of those titles. Now, on with our program. In the spotlight is Carla Kaplan, an award-winning professor and writer who holds the Stanton and Elisabeth Davis Distinguished Professorship in American Literature at Northeastern University, and she has also taught at the University of Southern California and Yale. Kaplan is the author of The Erotics of Talk and Zora, Neale, Hurston, A Life in Letters. A recipient of a Guggenheim and many other fellowships, Kaplan has been a fellow in residence at the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, and the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute, among other research centers. Her latest book is a biography titled Troublemaker, The Fierce, Unruly Life of Jessica Mitford. Carla Kaplan, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's start with how you discovered Jessica Mitford. I'd never heard of the woman before learning about your book, and what you learned about her that convinced you not only to be interested in her life, but decide to write a biography about her.
I'm so glad you're starting with that question, because for me, the discovery, or I guess the rediscovery of Jessica Mitford, was really one of those gifts you want and never think you're going to get and sort of wait all your life for. There was a funny way in which I had been looking for Jessica Mitford for decades without knowing at all that I was looking for Jessica Mitford or that I would be lucky enough to find her, which is to say, I had long been interested in being able to write the biography of a woman activist and writer who was really funny and fun to be with. Because there's a really long-standing myth with a lot of power in our culture that women activists are grim and they are gray and they are cheerless and nobody wants to be in the room with them. And I grew up surrounded by women activists who were a riot. And I thought somebody has to put the lie to this myth. I thought it was a terrible myth. So I had been looking for a funny woman activist, ideally a writer. Now, I didn't think I would be so lucky as for that to be Jessica Mitford, because I would really make the case she's the funniest activist in American history. I think it was her genius, it was her particular quality. It got her in a lot of trouble. Her sense of humor was truly irrepressible, even in the Communist Party, which didn't take well necessarily to a really robust sense of humor. But that's who she was. She couldn't stop it. So there was that. I was sort of, for a long time, looking for a very funny activist. But Jessica Mitford in particular kind of dropped into my life as a subject at a very particular moment in my own writing. I was working on my previous trade book, which was a sort of odd book called Miss Anne in Harlem, The White Women of the Black Renaissance. And that came out about 11 years ago, also with HarperCollins. And it was a group biography of a bunch of white women who kind of looked at the left bank and they said no. And then they sort of looked at Greenwich Village and they said, no, that's not quite right. And then, completely unaccountably, they looked at Black Harlem and said, that's where I'm going. I'm going to be part of the Harlem Renaissance. Now, I'm laughing because it was the most unlikely choice. And in many ways, it was a failure for these women. They went with their good intentions and often not much else. And they tried to be central players in a Black artistic political movement. And really, in some ways, that group biography ended up being the story of failed allies, of why people who go into other struggles with nothing but their good intentions end up being failed allies. And I thought it was an important story to tell. I think I still do. But I knew when I was one chapter into that book, I couldn't write another book about failed allies. It was too depressing to me. It was too sad.
Hmm.
And I was just dead set on the idea that my next book would be a book about a successful ally. Well, again, I didn't know that was going to get to be, of all people, Jessica Mitford, probably one of the most successful crossover allies in the history of the American left. And that's what drew me to her. That somebody who grew up in the British aristocracy. She grew up with wealth and privilege and status and comfort, and a lot of doors just being opened for her. Left all of that behind to live all her adult life in Oakland, California. It's harder to get further from the Cotswolds than Oakland, as an advocate and an ally in the civil rights movement, fighting mostly for Black Oaklanders. And I thought, what an amazing set of life choices. What an interesting preference. She always found her political life in Oakland and then her life as a writer much more fulfilling and satisfying than a life with country manners and horses and servants and, fancy fetes. And she didn't want any of that. She wanted to make a difference in the world and meet people who were different from her. And
Hmm.
she achieved it really quite spectacularly. So in
Let me
that,
stop you a minute. She grew up where again?
she grew up in the English Cotswolds, the most bucolic, rolling, idyllic, pastoral part of England. I've just come home from the Cotswolds. So I haven't even been home yet a week. And I had the privilege of staying in her childhood home for 2 nights and giving a talk in the library where she grew up reading. So the Cotswolds are deeply imprinted on me. And the charm of the Cotswolds is very refreshed for me. And it is a gorgeous part of the English countryside. It is where tourism in England really began because the area is so charming with rolling hills, and all of the buildings are built with this stone that comes out of the Cotswolds. And it's described quite rightly as honey colored, very kind of rich amber yellow color, and it glows in the sunlight. So these charming little stone cottages on these rolling hills next to these trout-filled rivers, right? It doesn't get much more idyllic than that. I mean, it's
Yeah.
really wind in the willows country, you know?
So
I don't
she
know,
goes from Downton Abbey to Oakland, California.
by choice, right? Not
What did she
because,
know about Oakland that drew her? Did she knew that
well,
the civil rights movement was very strong there?
she didn't know one single thing, which is the other thing about her that's so great. She had a remarkable ability to pivot, to take advantage of a new opportunity, to learn from her surroundings. Oakland turned out to be the best place in the world for her, but she didn't know it. She started her American life, if you will. She was only 19 when she came to the United States with her second cousin, Esmond Romilly, who became immediately her lover and her first husband. And he was a complete character. He was a famous British runaway who published his first book before he turned 16. And Esmond, like Jessica Mitford, who was always known as Decca, Esmond, like Decca, came out of the British aristocracy filled with the idea of his own sort of impermeability to disaster, that nothing could touch him. He ran away from boarding school. He and his brother wrote a book about the English education system. It was published before Esmond was 16, as I mentioned. He lived on the streets. He slept on a bookstore floor. And before Esmond was even 18, he ran away from England to fight in the Spanish Civil War. And he joined up in the Spanish Civil War to fight against fascism, to fight for the Spanish Republic, so early in that conflict that there wasn't yet an English volunteer brigade. In fact, when Esmond appeared, he had to join up with a brigade that was mostly German and Italian. It was called the Thalmann Brigade. And Esmond, who was very brave, he was both brave by nature and brave by class upbringing, ended up being one of only two survivors of his entire brigade. Everybody else was killed. He fought in the bloodiest, worst battles of both Madrid and Boadilla. He fought in the worst battles of the Spanish Civil War, and he almost died in the war. He got terrible dysentery at a time that was before antibiotics. He
Hmm.
nearly died. He was invalided back to England, where he did survive. And then his job, terrible job, just the worst, was to travel throughout the country and tell the families of the fallen how their loved ones had died in the Spanish Civil War. So that was his job. So he then needed to recover from that, and he went to the country house of a cousin, also an aristocrat. And the cousin had invited other guests, including Jessica Mitford, who had been in love with her cousin Esmond from afar for years. She'd never met him. They met over dinner. Jessica leaned into Esmond and she said, "Are you going back to the war?" And he said, "I am." And she said, "Will you take me?" And he said, "I will." And that was it. They established a complicated ruse to get her out of her family home. They ran away to Spain. They made their way back to working class England and then to the United States, where they were going to make their fame and fortune as lecturers on the British aristocracy. Well, that didn't work out at all. Esmond was full of ideas. He was full of schemes. He was also a gambler. And they gambled. He sold silk stockings door to door. She sold tweeds at the British booth at the World's Fair in New York. They tried opening a bar in Miami, Florida. Needless to say, that was a disaster. But when the war was declared, when England entered the war, Esmond, who was a socialist but also an anti-fascist and a patriot, he joined up right away with the Royal Canadian Air Force. And he was very quickly shot down and killed over the North Sea. And here was Jessica Mitford alone. She was a war widow. She had a young infant daughter. She was completely cut off from her family, who she called the filthy fascists, and she blamed them for Esmond's death because most of them were right wing. Some of them were exceedingly right wing. We might want to talk about that. And she wouldn't have taken money from them if they could have gotten it across, which you couldn't do during war. She had no education. Her parents were opposed to educating girls. They were just being raised to get married. She had no training. She had no money. Now she has no husband. And she had to make her way in the world. And it's remarkable to follow her as she does that. She's not even 21. She has no training. She's living in the home of Virginia and Clifford Durr, who are civil rights icons who have just taken pity on her. And she gets a job with the Office of Price Administration, which is a wartime regulation agency. She finds out she's a great investigator. This all becomes very important when she becomes a famous muckraker later. She finds out she's a great investigator. She eventually falls in love with somebody else about a year after Esmond's death, but she's not ready. So she runs away to San Francisco. She gets promoted and transferred by the OPA to San Francisco. And the man she had fallen in love with, a Jewish progressive lawyer named Bob Truhaft, luckily follows her to San Francisco. And they sort of hash it out and they get married, and she starts a new life and a new family. And together they build a new life in Oakland, California. So she's the first one to go to Northern California, but Bob follows her and they quickly establish a life in Oakland where she joins the Communist Party. So does Bob. She becomes a very important worker in the Communist Party's Civil Rights Congress. She does phenomenal civil rights work in Black Oakland, which also involves doing a lot of investigation and research. And she sort of becomes this entirely new person, having put the aristocracy behind her. I should probably stop there, right?
Let's give a. There's so much to say here, and you're
Yeah,
really framing
sorry.
it nicely. But just to frame the time period, she was born in 1917. She
Right.
died in 1996 at the age of
Yeah.
78, and she died in Oakland. So her choice to go to Oakland was an abiding one. It wasn't that she
Oh,
got
very
there,
much so.
worked for a while, and decided, well, I'm going to go to New York now, or back to
No.
London or somewhere. So very interesting that this decision she made, this adventure she went on was a lifelong one. Did her when she decided I'm going to go to the United States, I'm going to go to Oakland, did her family think she was nuts?
So, yes, I mean, they had been thinking she was nuts since she was about 8 years old. So the family, which included five sisters, all of whom became famous later as the Mitford girls, brilliant, beautiful, I just absolutely gorgeous young women, all of them creative and driven and completely denied any outlets. They were being raised to marry and perpetuate the aristocracy. None of them were none of them were satisfied with that. That wasn't sufficient for any of them. But all of them sort of accepted the protocols of the class they were born into. They all accepted the ways of the aristocracy, some more than others. Decca's youngest sister, Debo, always wanted to become a duchess, and she succeeded. She became the Duchess of Devonshire and the chatelaine of Chatsworth House, which is much, much grander than the house in Downton Abbey. Much of Downton Abbey is built on the Mitford family, but the house that they film Downton Abbey in is not as grand as Chatsworth by quite a
Oh,
bit.
oh wow.
So, when I say that many of them sort of aspired to perpetuate the aristocracy, uh, Deborah, known as Debo, especially so. But Decca never did. Decca always was that little child who looked around her and she kind of looked at everything in her world and she said, wait a minute. Something here doesn't make any sense to me. This is not adding up. And I mean, this is Decca at only 5 or 6. She would say, I don't get this. Why do we have so much and everybody else has basically nothing? That doesn't make any sense at all. We should start over and redistribute everything, and everybody should have the same. Now, we've all known little kids like that, right? Most of
Yes.
them outgrow it. Some of us have been little kids like that. Part of the magic and the charm for me of Jessica Mitford is that fierce child sense of justice never left her. And to her sisters, it made no sense. She was the only member of the family who looked at the world in that way. And she described it later in her memoir, in her autobiography, as a very lonely opposition. That she was of her family and she loved her family. She learned how to tell stories from her sisters. They invented languages. They played games. They pulled pranks. They teased. They read. They wrote together. They created dramas and narratives. And she loved all of that and she loved them, but she couldn't agree with them about anything. She didn't see the world in their way. So they thought she was crazy. She thought they were blind. And when she was a young child, she went into her local bank. It was called Drummond's Bank. And she opened something that she and the bank called her running away account. Now, she opened this when she was only 11 or 12. And she put every spare, cent she could get into her running away account. And that's the money she withdrew at 19 to run away with Esmond Romilly. So she always had her eye on escaping. She always had her eye on getting out of this world that, frankly, most other people would have given their right legs to get into.
Hmm.
But she alone amongst the whole family had a sense that the class system was not just deeply unethical, but for her, it wasn't any fun. She didn't want to be confined to the top of the apex. She was bored at the top of the apex. She wanted to know everybody. And as an aristocratic girl, she didn't get any mobility. She couldn't get to know everybody. She couldn't even really get to know the villagers, because, of course, everybody surrounding the family's manor house either worked for the family or they leased the family's land for their farms. So she was surrounded by her sisters and no peers, nobody at her level. And all she wanted to do was get the heck out of there and meet people from other walks of life. And so for her, the comforts of the aristocracy were a straitjacket, and her sisters thought she was out of her mind.
Hmm.
And when she married a Jewish lawyer and took up life in Oakland, California, they could not understand her for anything. And one of the things I reveal in my book is how snide they all were about her behind her back. To her face, they would say, "Oh, we miss you so much. We long for you." And behind her back, they would say, Decca doesn't even do her hair, and her husband is an old yellow peril. So behind her back, they said terrible things about her because her life choices, well, they not only didn't make sense to the rest of the family, but they posed a terrible challenge to the rest of the family. Had the family looked closely at Decca's choices and really seen them for the fulfilling choices they would have had to question their own way of life, and they were not willing to do that.
Yeah, yeah. Now, she did, as you mentioned in passing, write a memoir called Hans and Rebels.
Yeah.
And what didn't she include in the memoir that was that encouraged you to write the biography anyway? I mean, she told her own story. A lot of times, autobiographies are not to be trusted because people talk about only the good stuff. She doesn't sound like that kind of person, but you saw an opportunity to extend this beyond her own memoir. So, what about the biography that is additive?
It's a wonderful memoir. It's extremely funny. It's very tender in some places in her memories of England. It's very critical in her discussions of class society. Um, but it is funny first and foremost, and it does not go into anything that doesn't advance the mission of telling a funny, almost a silly story about her family's ridiculous aristocratic privilege.
Uh,
And so, what is completely left out of the book are two things, I think. One is the big question of my book, which is how does somebody from one world remake herself as a valued and a beloved member of a completely opposite world? What's that journey like? And how does somebody decide to do that? And what are the benefits of it? And what are the costs? And she never touches that. And the other thing she never touches are the truly tragic events in her life. Jessica Mitford had a very tragic life. She lost Esmond Romilly, her first love and first husband, when they'd only been married 4 years. She also lost two children quite tragically. She and Esmond had a young daughter named Julia, who she lost to measles in the worst possible way. She was living in working class England. She was going to the public health clinic. She was refusing the sort of private nurses that a young woman of her class would take as a given, and that her family probably even then, even though she'd run away, would have paid for. But at the public health clinic, the measles was then rampant in working class London. This was a neighborhood called Rotherhithe, and there was a measles epidemic. And this was just prior to the measles vaccine. There was no vaccine yet.
Mm.
But there was a strong understanding of inoculation by exposure. And the public health nurse took for granted that Decca had been exposed to measles in her life. Well, of course, as a British aristocrat, she was kept away from any other children, so she had never been exposed. So she had no natural immunity, no inoculation. She got measles. Her daughter Julia got terrible measles. Decca barely survived, and Julia did not.
Mm.
And
Wow.
it was just a tragic heartbreak. And it was a tragic heartbreak that had everything to do with her choices, with her choosing to live a working class life and her refusal of the privileges she'd been born to. She didn't tell anybody, no, I'm an aristocrat. I've had no exposure. She didn't say that. And her daughter
Mm.
died. And it was a terrible heartbreak. And she had a son later with Bob Truhaft named Nicky, an absolutely beloved son who was killed when he was 11 years old. He was struck by a bus when he was delivering newspapers on his paper route, and he was killed. None of these things appear in Jessica Mitford's memoir. In fact, Esmond Romilly is just a footnote. She doesn't talk about that. She wrote 2 volumes of her memoirs. She wrote Hans and Rebels, and then she wrote a wonderful memoir of her life in the Communist Party called A Fine Old Conflict, which is how she misheard the song The Internationale. The Internationale has a line that says, "It is the final conflict. Let each take his place." She misheard it as "'tis a fine old conflict." So that's what she called her memoir. And it's a very good memoir. It's a really wonderful introduction to why so many people in the 1940s and 50s in America loved the Communist Party and what they got from it and what they brought to it. But it doesn't mention Nikki. It doesn't mention the tragedies in her life. There's nothing in writing of Jessica Mitford's where she ever mentions Julia. And to this day, I have not been able to learn where Julia was buried.
Hmm.
So she was extremely closed-mouthed about any tragedy in her own life. And part of the way she had to transform herself and rebuild herself was in the face of tragedy. So I wanted to tell a much fuller story of how somebody leaves behind wealth and privilege, moves between worlds, and moves on after terrible tragedy, not by focusing on herself, but by focusing on the struggles of other people. So to me, there was a much larger story to tell than the one she told.
Yeah, yeah. So, these tragedies in her life, it just points to this indomitable personality that she had because despite the tragedies, she continued to live her life with both arms wrapped around it and with a great sense of humor. So she sounds like that was really the overarching part of her personality and also that and maybe also compartmentalization. I mean, maybe she was very good at compartmentalizing, or maybe it was just that was such a big part of her personality. Even tragedy couldn't snuff it out, as it does with so many people. I have to ask you though, this sounds like a movie or a television series. I'm curious whether you've. I know the book's fairly new. Has there been any interest shown in possibly taking this to the silver screen or a streaming channel?
Well, I hope so. Nothing to report at the moment. I also think it's a movie. I think it's a very cinematic life, and her life is filled with wild cinematic moments. When she and Esmond were in Spain, the family tried, of course, to get her back. And her father was a member of parliament. I have to tell you in a minute what his actual title was in parliament because it's a riot. But he was a member of parliament and he pulled out all the stops. And a British destroyer, a wartime destroyer, was sent to Spain to fetch Decca and Esmond home. And they refused to get on the destroyer, and the government, through Anthony Eden, made a deal with them, said, look, we can fit over 300 Spanish refugees on this destroyer and get them out of Spain, but we'll only do it if you get on as well.
Mm.
So, what could they do, right? They were sort of forced onto the destroyer, but they hopped off the ship in France. So they were supposed to stay on the destroyer to England, and they jumped ship in France. But what a cinematic moment that is. Here are these two teenage, gorgeous, young, aristocratic runaways being fetched by destroyer. I think her life is very cinematic. Let me go back to this for a second to her father. Her parents were famously eccentric. They were known by the children as Farve and Muv. It's, a very upper crust pronunciation of father and mother, Farve and Muv.
Hmm.
And Farve, David Redesdale, a member of Parliament, his official title in Parliament was Chancellor of the Drains. And he was
Well, what was
responsible
that again? I missed that. Chancellor of.
of the drains. I
Okay.
know, I have to explain. I have to explain. It's so kooky. His main responsibility in British Parliament and his obsession was keeping women out of the parliamentary bathrooms. And he was obsessed about this. He monitored the parliamentary plumbing. That's why he was the Chancellor of the Drains, because he was obsessed with the notion that women might try to sneak in and use Parliament's bathrooms. And to him, that was one of the worst horrors that could possibly be imagined. So this is the father of these six brilliant, beautiful, creative young women who are looking to make their mark on the world and being completely thwarted. And so they all bust out. Decca, of course, busts all the way out to Oakland, but some of her sisters bust out in the opposite direction and become just the worst fascists and Nazis imaginable. Um, and it was part of the tragedy of Decca's life. She lost three people to death, but she lost her whole family to politics, and she lost two of her sisters directly to Nazism and fascism and anti-Semitism. Her older sister, Diana, was left a husband to run away with Oswald Mosley, the head of the British Union of Fascists. They were married in Goebbels' backyard with Hitler in attendance.
Oh my
And
God.
yeah, and Nancy lived all her life completely unrepentant, ardent fascist and anti-Semite. She went to her death, uh, still very beautiful, very statuesque, insisting that the Holocaust was the fault of the Jews. Even at her death, she insisted on this. But Unity, Decca's favorite sister, actually stalked Hitler and became his intimate. And when the war was declared, she went into a park in Germany and took a little pistol out of her large handbag, put it up to her temple, and pulled the trigger. And the bullet went through her brain, lodged in the back of her skull, and she lived 8 more years with completely diminished capacities before she died of meningitis. So here's this
Wow.
left-wing Decca who runs away to fight for civil rights and to fight fascism in Spain. And she has one sister who's married to the head of the British Fascist Party, and another sister who is Hitler's intimate. So that was, in my view, every bit as much of a tragedy for Decca to lose them in that way as the loss of her two children and Esmond. And part of what I try to get at in the book is what it's like to come from such a divided family, what it's like to be the lone person with your perspective and point of view amongst a group who are not only so different from you, but who have become world famous for their differences. So when Decca's running away in America with Esmond, she's opening the newspaper literally on a daily basis to stories about her sister Unity with Hitler talking about what a Jew hater she is, and then being shot in the head, and whether she's alive or dead, and did she and Hitler have a love child? And she's literally in the newspapers in America every single day. And here's poor Decca reading these articles every day.
Wow. Wow. Um, Talk about being a biographer, and approaching this project in particular. You, what are what were you determining from the outset you needed to do in terms of research, but also the structuring of her story? Oftentimes, biographies run chronologically. I mean, it kind of makes sense. Um, how did you approach this biography? What did you know that you needed to really accomplish with it, and kind of how you went about that?
Being a biographer is a very strange professional choice. You have to have a really deep nerd's core, because what it means to be a biographer is you're going to spend years of your life going through somebody else's archive and their papers and their records. And the good news with Jessica Mitford was that she left behind a very robust archive. And the bad news with Jessica Mitford is that she left behind a ridiculously large archive. It totals about 600 banker's boxes.
Wow.
And yeah, crammed with material. She was a complete pack rat by her own description. She saved everything. They had a large house in Oakland, and the house had an attic that had a good, strong floor in it. And she just shoved everything up into the attic and saved it all. She never threw anything away. And I was trained as a biographer in the Robert Caro School of Research, which is to say that I take very much to heart Robert Caro's dictum that when you are a biographer going through someone's archive, you must, as he puts it, turn every page. You must look at every document. You can't assume that a file labeled business accounts isn't going to be interesting. So you have to open it and look. So I was faced with 600 banker's boxes of material and with the commitment to try to turn every page, which was daunting. And what I wanted to do with all that information, because by the time, of course, I had turned every page, I had a ridiculous wealth of information about which nobody could care less. So I knew like thousands of details of Jessica Mitford's life, which were fascinating to me because they were very hard won and they took me years to learn, but which frankly nobody needed to learn. So I had to be committed to learning all of those details and then letting them go and trying to focus instead on the pieces of her life that told the story that I thought mattered most, which is not whether she went to a meeting at 4:15 or 4:45. Nobody but me cares. But the larger story of how the choices she made both tell us about the world she lived in when she lived and vice versa. How her life was created out of this larger context of her times. As you mentioned, she was born in 1917. She came into adulthood during the Spanish Civil War. The probably to this day, the most important moment in global solidarity we've ever seen. We've never seen anything like it. It was a war in which thousands of people from around the globe volunteered not just to fight, but to die if necessary for people they'd never met, whose language they didn't speak, in a country in which they had no connection, purely for the principle of democracy and against fascism. I don't know that we've ever had another moment like that, where thousands and thousands of people go to another world to fight and die for other people. And that was her political education. That was the first real moment of progressive education Jessica Mitford experienced as a young woman. Well, what an imprint, right? I mean, what an incredible imprint to get as a young radical is to be part of the Spanish Civil War. And I wanted to tell a story, if possible, in which I could put together the context of her social world and her political world with her individual life and her individual choices. And you were asking me earlier about why she never talked about her tragedies. And I think it was part of her political perspective that having witnessed genuine suffering in the Spanish Civil War, in World War II, and then terrible suffering in Black Oakland and in the Black South, where she traveled and went to learn about racism. She didn't want to focus on her own personal troubles. She felt like her job was to put those aside and to focus on other people. And she had the strength of will to do that. Not everybody does. Not everybody would have been able to put aside all of those tragedies and just fight for other people. But that's something she could do and needed to do. It was, I think, the only way she could function. I think if she had given in to her own feelings, they would have swamped her. She was actually a person of very deep feeling, and I think she was keeping the feelings she couldn't handle kind of at bay to cope with them.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um,
So you had this mother load of information, 600 banker boxes. You must have highlighted or copied over a lot of content that you thought this could be in the book. Uh, and you must have had to make some hard choices on what to include and what to leave out. Talk about that process a little bit. How did you have any? What was your kind of philosophy behind what would stay and what had to not be included?
I had to fight with myself every day for years over this because I knew that my philosophy had to be that nothing could stay in the book unless it advanced some larger goal, that it was part of the theme or it was truly revelatory about who Decca was, that it was going to be something I came back to or that connected to something later, that no detail could stay in the book just because I liked it as a detail or because it took me days in the archive to find it. So that was my principle, but my heart was in the details. And so the first draft of this book was, oh, probably about 1,300 pages. Because I let myself, for the first draft, I let myself put it all in.
Hmm.
I couldn't get myself not to put it down on paper because it was so hard won. And here I knew all this stuff, that nobody else knew. So I put it all on paper and I petted the draft. And then I went at the draft, with a Sharpie and took all of that back out. And then I had to do it again. And then I had to do it again. And then I had to do it again. Um,
And
and
after you
here's
did that, did your agent or editor say you need to do even more, or did you
did.
successfully narrow it down? Or you were told even more needs to come out?
When I thought I was about done killing my darlings, taking out all the, my wonderful little details, my editor said, no, you still got about 50 more pages that have to come out. It needs to read at a slightly different pace. You got to take out about 50 more pages. And I was so mad, and then of course I sat down and I thought to myself, she's exactly right. And I took out about another 90. So that was
Wow.
the final round of cuts.
So
I
she was
tried to,
focused, and I suspect you were focused on the idea that this thing has to have a certain velocity. We need to move it along. I mean, readers get impatient, and
yes.
so you and your editor were focused on a certain tempo to the biography.
We were. We wanted it to read um, with a tempo. We wanted it to read as a narrative that kept the reader in mind and that remembered that whether or not I knew all the meetings Decca attended as a Communist Party member, in 1949, nobody cares about that. So what it couldn't be was a chronicle. It couldn't be a book that said at 9:15 Mike had oatmeal At 9:45, Mike walked the dog. At 10:20, he answered emails.
Mhm.
Because nobody cares about that.
Right.
And too many biographies really do that. They provide a kind of a chronicle of a life. And I'm sure I'm still guiltier of that than I realize. But the goal was to keep this book from being a chronicle and to keep it as a story about how somebody comes out of one social context and has a massive impact in another. We haven't talked much about her writing, but the third phase of her career, if you divide her life in thirds, it's aristocrat, communist activist, and then celebrity, breakout, wildly crazy successful writer, which she didn't expect. And and I teach English. So for me, it was the sections and the chapters on her writing where I had to make the deepest cuts. I had so much I wanted to say about her drafting process, about the way she worked as a writer, about the way she researched, about the reception of her work, about the way different pieces of her writing spoke to one another, about the way she learned from other writers, what was in her library, who was she reading, who was she responding to, what were the allusions. And I had to winnow that way, way down because while it is the biography of a writer, most readers don't want that level of detail. So those were some of the chapters that took the deepest cuts.
Yeah. Well, now the Robert Caro School, which you referenced earlier, might have
Yeah.
said, well, do two or three biographies like I did with LBJ. Uh,
You
that
know,
that
it's
was
so
not,
it's
I mean, it
so
would have been
funny.
monumental.
It's so funny that you say that. Um, as I was working on this book, which took 10 years, I was a member of two wonderful writing groups. Um, as it happens, all of the members of my two writing groups were women, and all of them were historians. I'm actually not trained as an historian, I'm trained in English. But they were all women historians, and they were all saying, you should make this a two-volume book. But the truth is, with the wonderful exception of Blanche Wiesen-Cook's three-volume biography of Eleanor Roosevelt, there are almost no multi-volume biographies of women.
Hmm.
There remains a sort of gender divide. First of all, publishers don't want multi-volume biographies of anybody. I don't know if Chernow's Mark Twain was supposed to be two volumes and that's why it's over 1,000 pages or not.
Yes.
I don't know. I don't know what the back conversation is. I know that publishers do not like multi-volume books. But it is also true that there are, as I mentioned, almost no multi-volume books on women. So there was never a chance that this was going to be a multi-volume book. And I think, in honesty, if I'm being honest, that most of what I cut, the book can live without.
Hmm.
It was hard
Hmm.
for me to live without it, but I think it's a long enough book. It's not as long as it seems. I know some readers are afraid of it, but people need to know about 150 pages are notes and bibliography, and you don't have to read that. So it's not as bad as it seems. It's under 500 pages. I think it's long enough, and I think people get a sense of the granular flavor of Jessica Mitford's life from the book, or at least I hope they do.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, if lightning strikes, and this is does well, I often say to my wife with streaming series now, multiple episodes, multiple seasons, you could do justice to War and Peace for that matter. So if your book was your biography was to go to a streaming series, all that additional content that you had to leave out could possibly be activated for seasons, 4, 5, 6. I mean, obviously that's
Exactly.
very aspirational, but you've got a tremendous amount of content, potential content outside of the biography that could be
That's right.
brought to bear at some point. So let
I'm
me,
going to bring you in. I'm going to bring you in as a producer, and I want you to know I'm not throwing away any of the files. So I still have all the material.
there you go. There you go. So for the person who is listening uh, to your story, to Jessica Mitford's story, Carla, and they're an aspiring biographer, what kind of advice would you give to aspiring biographers given your experience with it?
Um, so I think the hardest thing for aspiring biographers to learn is what you and I were just talking about, is to step back from our own fascination with our subjects as biographers and to think about what would truly interest readers and what do readers find interesting. All too often, aspiring biographers are fascinated by a family member who they've always wanted to know more about, a very eccentric uncle, a missing grandparent, a sibling who did remarkable things. And they are so interested in that person and the detail of that person's life, they don't always ask the question, is this interesting to readers?
Hmm.
So, one of the questions that an aspiring biographer needs to ask is your interest in this person also something other people would have, and why? Why would they be interested in this person? What would draw them? What's the either the lesson of this person's life or the takeaway or what's remarkable about it or unusual about it? In my last book, Miss Anne in Harlem, I think what made those women interesting is they made a very, at the time, an extremely unlikely choice. It was a very weird thing to try to do. And the weirdness of that makes them interesting, I think, to other people. They try to do a very unlikely thing. Had they not tried to do that, I wouldn't have told their story. You have to, there has to be something that draws readers in. And the other question is there enough source material for a life? You can have too much source material, as I almost had, but you have to have some source material. So, are there letters? Are there people who can be interviewed? I interviewed 50 people for Troublemaker. Is there an archive? Are there biographies? Are there records? The other question that biographers talk a lot about when we get together and we dish, and we have a drink in our hands and we really talk about it, is the world of biographers divides very neatly into two camps. There is the camp of biographer who is perfectly willing to write about the living and who may in fact be really brave about writing about living people. I think about Kitty Kelly and how Kitty Kelly just keeps taking on living person after living person. She's so brave about it and so amazing. And then there's the camp of people like me who will only write about the dead. That's it. We're not writing about anybody who's alive. In fact, I try to write about people who are dead and have no family members. Because even though the family can be a wonderful source of material and information, they also sometimes want to see your draft, or they want you to tell this a certain way, or they want to be
Hmm.
involved. And I can't work that way. So
Yeah.
that's another kind of a question. People who think they're going to write about their families may not realize that that involves all of the family telling you what the story should look like. And so I urge people to think twice about doing that. So I think the person's life has to give us something for the current moment. And goodness knows Jessica Mitford speaks volumes to the current moment, a lifelong anti-fascist, a person who could not, it was constitutionally impossible for Decca to bend the knee. She couldn't do it. It wasn't in her nature. She had to go after every single bully that came near her. She couldn't stand bullies. She couldn't stand authoritarianism. So she very much speaks to the contemporary moment in that way. We could really use a big dose of her today. She'd be a lot
Yes.
of fun to have back in the room. Um,
Absolutely.
so the figure doesn't have to be in the present. My friend Amanda Vale has written a gorgeous historical biography of the Schuyler sisters. The sisters, sort of the backstory behind the story of Hamilton. But it has to speak to the contemporary moment in some way.
I would
So
just
those are things I'd say.
Yeah, I would just add to what you were saying that Walter Isaacson had been doing biographies on those who have entered immortality. And then Steve Jobs comes along and says, or one of his representatives said, "We'd like you to do his biography." He said, "I don't do biographies about people who are living,"
Yeah,
until it was explained to him that, well, I'm terminally ill and I want to be able to tell a biographer my story. And not only did he write that one, did he capitulate and decide to write it? And clearly, Steve Jobs is an interesting enough character to have a biography written, but Walter Isaacson was more interested in after he
yeah,
was gone. But he ends up writing that. And then, and my understanding is Steve Jobs actually didn't interfere at all, which is hard to believe
yeah.
because was such a controlling guy, and never read
Was
it.
such a control freak, right? And I guess
He
didn't read it, right? There
Yeah, he
was a
didn't
lot.
he didn't want to read it
There was,
because I think he
yeah,
I think he just trusted him, and he trusted him with the selection of the cover image, which was really classic Jobs. But then he also wrote about Elon Musk. So obviously Steve Jobs
yeah,
broke him of this idea that only the deceased, because then he turned around and wrote about Elon Musk. So
exactly.
I mean, just another way of how it played out with Isaacson.
I tried to write about one living person. I spent years courting the amazing American poet Adrienne Rich. And I was courting Rich while she was still alive because I felt that whoever did Rich's story needed to do it while Adrienne Rich was alive. Partly that Rich would have to tell people whether or not they should talk to this person, and we had a series of conversations. I don't think I was the only one who was courting her, but we had a series of conversations in which she understood the reasons I wanted to tell her story and what I wanted to do with it. And what it finally came down to for her is she knew she was running out of time. She was very ill, and she didn't want to spend the time she had left with a biographer. She wanted to write whatever poetry she still could, whatever
Mm.
essays she still could, to do the writing that mattered most to her. So she thought about it for a long time and ultimately said no. That's my one that got away. I had really wanted to do Adrienne Rich's life and her poetry.
Yeah, yeah.
But once she said no, I accepted that and went on my way.
Well, speaking of getting on your way, final question. Do you have you embarked on a new project, Carla, or do you have something in mind that you're yet to start?
I have embarked on a couple of projects that will keep me very busy while I think about if my idea for another group biography really is a go or not. And the
Did you
two
say
projects,
group
yeah,
biography? Okay.
another group biography. The two projects I'm hoping to work on over the next few months. One would be a collection of Jessica Mitford's essays. She collected some of her essays under the title Poison Penmanship while she was still alive. And it's a lovely connection, but it's quite small. And she wrote brilliant, amazing, hysterical essays that have never been republished. And I'd like to put those together as a book. I think they speak to the current moment, and they're delicious and funny and remarkable. And I'm also writing a short book on Zora Neale Hurston and why Zora Neale Hurston, who came to fame 100 years ago, still matters today. Why her vision of the world and her writing is so important to continue to turn to 100 years later. So I'm working on those two things
Interesting.
these days.
I wish you luck with that. To our listeners, again, the name of the biography is Troublemaker: The Fierce, Unruly Life of Jessica Mitford. There is a link in the episode notes to Carla Kaplan's website where you can buy the book right from there. And Carla, thanks a million for coming on the program. What an amazing woman Jessica Mitford is, and really appreciate that you found this diamond somewhat in the rough, you might say, and you've really brought her back out into public view. Thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you so much for having me. It was such a pleasure to talk to you.